Chapter 5.4 is sum and difference formulas. We're going to use the sum and difference formulas to evaluate trig functions, verify identities, and solve trig equations. Here are the sum and difference formulas, and you do need to get them memorized. So one way that I think about it is that we have sine u plus v. It's sine of u cosine v plus cosine u sine of v. And then sine of u minus v, it's the same thing except the sign is negative. So with sine, the sign is the same, and then you just alternate each time. So sine and cosine, and then cosine sine. For cosine, you have cosine of u plus v. It's cosine u cosine v, so the cosines are grouped together, but you have a negative sign, and then it's a sine grouped together. Then for cosine u minus v, it's cosine u cosine v, but the sign is positive, sine u sine v. Tangent of u plus v, it's tangent of u plus tangent of v, and at the bottom it's 1 minus tan u tangent of v. So it's positive on top, negative on bottom, so positive, positive. And then for tangent, it's negative, negative, and then positive on the bottom. So, they're all very similar, and so maybe that'll help you in memorizing these formulas. So we're going to try and evaluate a trig function, or we will evaluate a trig function. Find the exact value of sine of pi over 12. So when we're thinking about that, we have pi over 12, and we know we can only use certain values. So one way that I think about it is we know we have pi over 3 and pi over 4. And so we have to be able to add or subtract those. Pi over 3, pi over 4. We need a common denominator. I know 3 and 4 is 12. And so let's just get a common denominator first. So this is 4 pi over 12 and 3 pi over 12. And so that's helpful because I know if I have 4 and 3, I can make a pi over 12, right? I just have to subtract them. So what I can write is sine of pi over 3 minus pi over 4. Pi over 3 is the 4 pi over 12, and pi over 4 is the 3 pi over 12. And so what I can do is use the difference formula for sine, and so that's sine of pi over 3 times cosine of pi over 4 minus cosine of pi over 3 times sine of pi over 4. And then we know these values. We know pi over 3 and we know pi over 4. So we're in the first quadrant. Sine of pi over 3 we know is root 3 over 2. Cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Minus cosine of pi over 3, that is a half. And sine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Then we simplify. So this is root 6 over 4 minus root 2 over 4. I have to tell you that in the book, what it does sometimes is it factors out this common root 2. And so in the book, or maybe in WebAssign, it might take only this as the answer, root 2 over 4 times square root of 3 minus 1. But this is totally fine for me. You can keep it just like that. Or actually, you simplify a little more. You say root 6 minus root 2 all over 4. Okay, so that's the one that I would really want. So find the exact value of cosine of pi over 12. And so this is at least helpful because you already know pi over 3 minus pi over 4 is pi over 12. But I want you to be able to use the difference formula for cosine. So in this one, you use cosine of pi over 3 minus pi over 4. So cosine of pi over 3 times cosine of pi over 4 plus sine of pi over 3 times sine of pi over 4. Then you substitute the right values, and this is the answer you get. Now let's do the same thing, but with degrees. So find the exact value of cosine of 75 degrees. So we can only use our angles that we use often, so that we know the exact values for. So 30, 45, and 60, we need to make 75 degrees. And I know there's different ways to make it. One way to make this is I can say cosine of 30 degrees plus 45 degrees. Then we use the sum formula. Cosine of 30 degrees times cosine of 45 degrees. Then since it's plus, it's a negative sine of 30 degrees times sine of 45 degrees. So cosine of 30, that is root 3 over 2, cosine of 45, root 2 over 2, minus sine of 30, 1/2. Sine of 45 is root 2 over 2. You simplify that as root 6 minus root 2 all over 4. So try the exact value of sine of 75 degrees. So for this example, you use sine of 30 plus 45 degrees. So sine of 30 times cosine of 45 plus cosine of 30 times sine of 45 degrees. Then you change all the values, and you would get root 2 plus root 6 all over 4.